Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discuss. My name is Patrick Okigbo, founder Next Year. Next Year is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving complex development problems. Development Discuss is our public policy discussion platform, which we use to ideate solutions for Africa. Nigeria is in a bind, underperforming on almost all socioeconomic indicators. And this is a combination of decades of poor policy design, poor choices, largely incompetence, overdependence on crude oil, and just across the board bad behavior. There's a raging tempest now. It's looming ahead. But in Africa, we have rainmakers, right? We have cloud movers. They have the science for preventing storms. The question is whether my guest today is a good cloud mover. Can he divine the solutions to Nigeria's challenges? Can he help us reimagine Nigeria's future? Dr. Sam Amadi is one of Nigeria's really insightful thinkers. He's the founder of Abuja School of Social and Political Thought. It's a think tank in Abuja. Prior to this position, he was chief executive chairman of the Nigeria Electricity Regulatory Commission. Prior to all of these, and he was a chairman of several technical committees in the Nigeria Senate. Before all of these, he was a senior counsel with Gani Fawehi's chambers, Olisa Bakoba chambers. He was the senior counsel for Ken Saro-Wiwa during his trial. Unfortunately, he was executed by the Nigeria government. Sam has a master's degree and PhD from Harvard Law. He's also a fellow at the Carr Center. Sam, welcome back to Development Discourse.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon, Patrick, and I'm happy to be here as always.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Interestingly, you were my first guest on Development Discourse many years ago. So I'm happy to have you back.
Oh, that's a pleasure.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great honor.
So maybe we start with, how do we make sense of where we are as a country, right? Going from a country that was way better than China in the 1980s to being a country that's today the third largest borrower nation from the World Bank. How did we get here? How did we get from having our debt forgiven about 20 years ago to a point today where our revenues are not enough to cover the interest payment on our debt? Can you help us unpack these issues?
Well, I think first, the getting our debts forgiven by the World Bank, which is another Paris debtors, creditors, was an act of policy. In a way, people would say genius. Maybe people thought we did something good. We did something good, and it didn't. We didn't quite build on it. But the question then is, that's like Band-Aid. That's like Band-Aid. You're trying to solve a problem, you've not solved that problem. But you did a Band-Aid. But the question then is, we got back into debt. So the question is it a wise policy? Yes, it was. But then we didn't grow ourselves out of debt, meaning we've got debt forgiven, we did some smart bookkeeping, but we didn't invest, expand our capacity. This is over 15, 20, up to 20 years ago. So we didn't even create a capacity for economic growth because the government kept talking about the debt GDP is not that much, but the debt revenue servicing is prohibitive. The revenue service versus the debt versus revenue in the servicing of debt, not even the debt, the servicing is where the problem lies. And that speaks to the inefficiency, the contraction in our economy. So the first answer is yes, we solved that problem, which is more like political leadership by Okonjo-Iweala and Obasanjo to probably give us a good head start. And it was part of an international campaign for some kind of jubilee. The nation is highly indebted countries need a fresh start. But a fresh start can be a false start, meaning that you start fresh, but you started badly. And so down the road, you are still faltering, you are still falling behind. And so we got a fresh start, but we didn't get the right start. We didn't build on that to expand our capacity so that even if our debt grows, our economy could carry it. We don't need to use 98% of revenue in some cases to service debt, not even to pay them off. So that's what we had today. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I really want to understand, right? So there are so many theories that kind of explain why we are where we are. Pick your scholar that you prefer, and I know you were working on some theory of conceptual incoherence. If you can just look at all of these theories from Sachs to North to Acemoglu to conceptual incoherence, what really makes sense? What explains that you had a clean balance sheet 20 years ago, and today, 9,800% of your revenues can't even service the debt? What explains it? What is it about us as a people, as a nation, what is it that makes it impossible for us to move forward?
Interesting, because right now I'm actually doing a small book on economic development, looking at what happened in Eastern Nigeria, and basically bringing together the argument around what's responsible for growth and development. Two related but distinct things. So first is, I think the structuralists, and they are multidimensional, they're of many variety, speak to it. One is structure in terms of in this case, not necessarily dual economy, traditional modern in the Lewis sense, but again, you have an economy that is still kind of held down by several factors. So first explanation is that this is not, people talk about productivity and consumption, that this is not a productive economy. And by that, they don't mean that we don't have factories. They mean that, in my view, that our focus is not to grow the economy as a obsession. If you look at the developmental states of Asia, even the European during the industrial era and towards even after the Second World War, there's some like obsession, with development, with growth. The economy has to grow, and people have also argued that it's a social paranoia. If you look at Japan, trapped in a situation where it has a threat to survival. And then the developmental state in Japan arose more like a military complex, the end of a carryover of an era of military buildup to fight a war. And so that energy, that national energy, and you can't talk about economic growth in this century without talking about some kind of nationalism. So that national energy was transmuted into civilian production, into economic growth. And so you had a central agency that had responsibility to, it's not about control. So the new political economists will argue against what they call the African Code, whether it's Robert Bates, look at the fact that we control commodity pricing, control here, licensing scheme that creates poverty, creates corruption, enhance the power of bureaucrats, distort market, and ended up being unproductive. But what they did was not that sort of thing. They were more focused in looking at where do we get the biggest bang. So they interfered in markets. Some scholars said they got prices wrong, deliberate. They didn't get it wrong in a bid to expropriate or extort. They got prices wrong in that they basically knew that the price system in a particular time may not produce the efficiency they wanted. So getting price wrong in the Asian classical sense is not recklessly interfering with markets, it's not hijacking transactions for personal gain. It's basically understanding that there are externalities and market failures and that the price system need to be used to achieve development. So missing thing here is Nigeria didn't have and has not had a national development agenda, being an agenda that is lived not on paper. So smart people like you probably have been constructing some agenda for different levels of government. That's not the national development agenda. It's on paper. So Okigbo and Nestia write something for us. You do a great job. They use it there. They say it's their own project, but it doesn't define the behavior. It's not a vital instrument in governance. That's part of the explanation. So yes, Obasanjo had some big ideas, went to seminars across the world. And just now, I just finished teaching some people. I talked about 4 C's, clarity. And that clarity is about a diagnosis of where we are now. So if you look at Asia, Japan, China, if you look at all these institutions, these places, they were clear-minded as to the diagnosis of their problem, where they are, where they want to be, and they had coherence, back to coherence. Meaning coherence is very simple. It's the idea that, look, if your diagnosis, like in Korea, is how do we become an economic power, be able to survive China, survive North Korea, survive, a very competitive environment. And to do that, we need to move from agrarian economy to an industrial economy. We need to begin to produce these, maybe the chemical industries they started with, or maybe go to the auto industries and become a leader in our region. That is a vision that now calls for certain realignment of your structure. People talk about sacrifices. Yes, but look at the problem. Our own sacrifice today is purposeless, because it's not a sacrifice that is geared coherently to a strategic vision that we're going to emerge the next 10 years. But there's where they had brutality, maybe brutal government, they had some human rights violations and all that. So I think that coherence explains it. The lack of a development agenda and the inability to have a leading elite who are obsessed about it and put everything together. Coordination failure is at the heart of it.
So I struggle with that thinking, Sam. So if we go back to the 60s, right, we had 5-year rolling plans, like was the vogue at the time. The Russians and the Chinese, kind of premiered that idea. But it did not lead to the kind of development we were looking for, correct?
Absolutely.
Now,
Absolutely.
if you look at, even in that same era, and I think this will probably reflect in the book you said you're working on in, Southeast Development. You had a Michael Okpara in Eastern Nigeria, who implemented certain philosophies, democratic socialism, etc., that drove the region to become one of the fastest growing regions in the world. But if you then look at, say, China and the work of Yuan Ang in, how China escaped the poverty trap, where she talked about co-evolution and so on. Those are great ideas that are steeped in almost the philosophy of the peasants, driving it. So my question, therefore, is our problem a lack of development agenda, a lack of a guiding philosophy, or is it a problem with the character of the people driving it? And in answering that question, is it a problem with the leaders or the followers? Because leadership cannot exist outside of a host. It is reflective of the host and the followers being the host. So is it really that we as a people do not have what it takes to develop?
Okay. It's good you mentioned China and also mentioned Korea. Now, put this way, there's no one single account of why development didn't happen or happened. What happens is that sometimes people talk about maybe fortune, you are lucky, some happenstance. But putting everything together, I would say, look, followers, yes. But followers, if you look at the history of development, there's always the planning aspect. Planning is, the old era classical economics of planning fell into disuse because of the failure in Africa largely. So people feel, oh, planned economies collapse. But then again, back to Korea and Japan. The guy called Johnson Chalmers wrote about MITI. And the point he made is that not the planned socialist planner. He talked to him more now about what you call techno-industrialization and the idea of a developmental state. Being a state is not planned, but planning is continuous. So you have to be adaptive. You have to look at what works. So China, for example, the earlier period of 1958 when Deng started and the later period are different. But what is consistent is that they are scanning their environment, seeing the advantages they have and disadvantages, and adapting tools and processes to reflect on a particular interventions that builds on market, builds on principle, builds on what exists to optimize outcome. So the plan I think around is the notion that somebody has to do diagnosis. Where are we in the world? Now, for example, there are disruptive technologies that have changed how we can grow. We're not talking about AI, we're talking about transition energy transition plan. So a country, the industrial policy today will not be exactly the industrial policy of 1960. But what is constant for those who will still develop is that they must be like the 1960 people to look at the environment, to construct their people like Yusuf Ulain, the former World Bank, argue about the new structuralists, talking about competitive advantage again. So they're going to look at where in this world economy can we plug and play? Where are we? Who will we displace? So take, for example, Nigeria. We might be thinking about Taiwan. Look at all those places. I say, as they migrate, can we occupy that space? So it's about leadership. But then you made a point about followership. Followership is, for me, a proxy for social state-society relationship. Meaning that the nature of the state and its relationship to its various components, Peter Evans talked about embeddedness in that technical language, will affect this development trajectory. So in the case of Nigeria, leaders emerge. They also are tied down by their followers, the kind of followers we have. But it's ultimately a question of leadership, not in the individual alone, the president, the prime minister. It's the leadership in the sense of influence, or the sense of leadership cadre, who shape a narrative around citizenship and their commitment and their relationship to leadership, and also the relationship to productive process. So it may take, again, some people talk about evolutionary trend. It may not, this might build from their past. And that's where friends, Asumogo, them coming now. The past may play a role in type of providing the cultural, the normative, and the structural legacy that you build into that fellowship. So we fought a civil war, we've always had tribalism, we've had several military rule. We're not going to evolve that leadership elite and the development agenda in the same way, say, Tanzania will evolve, that has not had those experiences. So our experiences might require a lot more intermediation, how to create a lot more coordination in terms of creating a governing elite. It may require different pathways. So that's why I say citizenship is probably a problem, meaning, leaders emerge, but they don't have the convening power, they don't have the sustainable power to drive it. So it's back to leadership, but in a more expansive sense of how do you construct a partnership and a compact that drives development.
We will come to that. Because I really want to get into both the politics of it and elections and so on. But let's stay with two case studies, right? The first one is Okpara. Yeah. We saw how in 6 years, very commonsensical policies drove the economy of a region, and it became the second fastest growing in the world, right? We saw an OBJ, Obasanjo, arrive in 99, and by the time he left 8 years later, Nigeria was a different world. Yeah, you can have whatever issues you have with the man, I have mine, but you can never begrudge him the fact that he did a few things that just got us on that growth trajectory, which we have finally crashed in the last 8 years. Okay. If you focus on just these two examples, because they are local to us, we understand them, we know what happened. What is it that made these two episodes so progressive, so successful, with the same human beings, the same environment, the same history, but almost every other administration in between has struggled or indeed failed to deliver at that same level? I think if we can understand these two as bookends, then we can.
Absolutely. Okay, let's start with Okpara. Okay, three factors I can account. One, the era. Okpara came in at the era where planning was the vogue. So you saw the East Asian. We're talking about from 1956. Okay, let's say from 1950 before independence, 1963 Republican, and then everything ended in 1966 or thereabout. So this is an era marked at the same period that South Korea was taking off under General Park. So this was an era of development economics where structuralists were in the vogue. Those who are thinking big, dependency theorists were looking at it, world system theorists. So something was in the air. And the people that he brought together came from Northwestern, from Oxford, Cambridge economists who were thinking also about state building was in the air. So that's number one. So the macro environment was enabling in the sense that people were focused on big development, catching up, We saw Japan catch up, we saw Korea catch up. So the Southeast and the regions were competing. That's about number two. So I talk about the macro. Number two, the structure of the politics was different. So you had the politics defined by developmental parties. I mean, some of them got it wrong in Africa, socialists, Marxists, ended the war, and many people have written about why that went wrong. But the point was that you now had that elite consensus around development. And so the political party, NCC, could be said to be a developmental party. They had cadres, they came together, they were able to drive it. The third thing I think that's important is you had a more confident environment where civil society state leadership was better. So the southeastern Nigeria, predominantly Igbo people. And then he had these democratic community-based structures to leverage. And then they had, if you like, a cross of scholars, technocrats who came together, had a more accountable state assembly, Eastern Nigeria House of Assembly. So everything there was authenticity about it. There was representation and a sense, and this is important also for the literature on the mental state, that you saw that the people themselves were psychologically connected to the project. After the Japanese War, and there was a sense of national, I use the word nationalism in economics. In fact, right from the great economists, nationalism is part of economic development. It doesn't have to be virulent in terms of supremacist nationalism, but the idea of a nation surviving, growing in Eastern Nigeria was clear that look, we needed to something big, we needed to grow, we needed to become great, compete with Southwest or Western Nigeria, compete with Northern Nigeria. And each of these development centers, we are very, very obsessed about development. So you've solved that social crisis, which is how do we create an elite that is discipline focused and that has legitimate tie with the people, so that when they're talking about Onwaka, Onwoyibo, Onwobodo in the Southeastern Nigeria, it resonated with the people themselves who psychologically were part of that bigger, agenda. Now, Obasanjo, stepping back, again, we must put the point that Obasanjo, in relative terms, was a great success. But in a bigger term, we didn't see a shift in both the culture and the structure of production. So in relative term, that he cleared the debts, GDP grew.
Compared to other Nigerian.
Exactly. Yeah. So, but it also fall into that era of big structural transformation. But again, succeeding because don't forget the history. We just switched from a ruinous military rule. There was so much hope. This guy came from prison with a persona, and he understood. This is also the issue about leadership. So the question then is, great leaders can cause a shift in perception, what you call redefining leadership. They redefine the moment. I said, look, this is a moment for mobilizing towards development. He brought a team of experts, smart people. So they set up an agenda, and then PDP, back to Okpara model. So the NCC, that was the PDP to today, may not be PDP, but PDP then was a pan-Nigerian platform that you saw, cuts across, even the team he put together, they had that nationalistic outlook. In fact, they bragged themselves as the Nigerian equivalent of Atatürk, or, great reformers, even though they had entire contradiction. But so that was a different PDP, a different leader, Obasanjo, who had some sense of spiritual connection to be this great founder of Nigeria, and felt that second time around, surviving almost death and coming to become president in that manner, he needed to move the country to a different level. You have a party that was broad-based enough, that had intellectuals who were thinking about development, even though incoherently, so they pushed something.
Okay.
If you look at the theory around how this can work, the evidence supports it largely. That one, you just have to have a development agenda. It might not be elitist in the sense that one person thinks of. It might evolve from the struggle of the people, from the experience, from the tragedies they have suffered, and they build a psychological commitment to surviving in a very amidst essential risk, like Japan did in the after the
Second World War.
Second World War, or Korea did in the context of North Korea and everything. or even Taiwan is trying to do in a very, you have to be paranoid in a paranoid situation. That's part of it. So that developmental agenda is there. The elite that has capacity and credibility and legitimacy, and a political construct that sustains that, and then somewhat a citizenry that has been either mobilized through messaging to understand that this is a special moment and somewhat willing, even if they don't have the power to ask the government or uphold it, but they are willing themselves to learn new ways of doing things. That's critical.
So let me see if I can unpack what I'm hearing and what I'm thinking. Yeah. So there are two factors here. On the one hand, if you're lucky to find a leader who internally can understand the moment and rise to it. So Okpara understood the moment. So did Awolowo. So did the Sadwana and so on. And they rose to the moment. They got in that competition. They tried to outdo each other, and that led to development. Obasanjo understood the moment as well. But there's also the second angle of the external factors that can push these leaders to rise to the occasion. So when we talk about elite consensus and all of that, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Something needs to push the people, to do well, to push the leaders to do well for the people. Okay. So my argument, or something I've started pushing, more recently, is that there needs to be that this is really a failure of civil society. It's really a failure of civil society that hasn't been able to shape where we are as a nation for Nigerians. For instance, if we were able to explain to Nigerians that we are actually in our second fight for independence. This is we should be fighting for our second independence. First independence was independence from the colonial masters. This independence is independence from colonial masters, but local, right? Because the way the elites carry themselves today is no different from the way the extractive British government did back in the 60s. So if my premise is correct, isn't this really a failure of your constituency, civil society?
Well, in a sense, I mean, if you define civil society as is defined classically from Hegel to everybody, which is difference between the gap between family and government, then you are right. But look, the problem is that if you now ask how these are the examples of use, what role the civil society play? Now, civil society itself reflects the lack of coherence and concentration. Look, the civil society agenda would be okay, fine. Human rights, those are important, or democracy, governance, as the idea of rule-based structure. That works. But the responsibility to say, three things here, the responsibility to define the direction a country goes can flow from civil society, but the signing off is somebody else. By the way, when Obasanjo they were doing Otafam before he became president, or towards the run-up, and so he had a lot of civil society people working with him. But some of the people in his team were also civil society of a class, of obvious question. Well, this society, Soludo, they were civil society in a sense. So in a sense, yeah, civil society can play that role, but it has to be a transformed civil society. It has to be a reformatted. You see, everything that will be used for this revolution, quote unquote, is available. But they need to change their complexity, just like chemical operation in a laboratory. You have to change the composition of the elements. You have to change them, and they enter into new forms, in which forms they cannot produce new outcomes. So a civil society, and I totally believe that government itself should be funding civil society in a sense that they want a particular kind of civil society. Civil society that understands the development trajectory, and itself argues for it. Now, you would also need some coherence. Means that, in a way, the message has to be clear. The thing about development is that development is like a jealous God. It's going to be like mania. You have to think about it. It requires upward and downward revisions. It changes behavior, changes processes. You have to also change even culture, inherited, received wisdom. You change them. And that's why if you look at my favorite, scholars on this, even starting from Arthur Lewis or Stiglitz, it's about transformation. Because even in the past, if you look at the history of the other countries, some people talk about evolutionary. Many things changed. So civil society can play that role, but they must play that role in the sense that they will be able to distinguish between the good governance, the things that are important for us, human rights, and development. That you can have all these things and not have development. Now, this is how I consider development. First is that anchored on growth, rapid, sustained economic growth. And economic growth simply means that you are producing more at less, more and more. That's one. Number two, development will involve human development. People talk about development as freedom. So it will also involve distribution things about, how we live our life, quality of life. But driving this will be the construction that the society is moved from a higher level, one level to a higher level. So the civil society can play that key role, but there must be a civil society that has a mission and a legitimacy and a connection to apparatus of allocation and use of resources, which is the state. So you can't get away from constructing a developmental state. Part of that resource or part of the fundamental to that developmental state will be a civil society. By the way, whether it's Japan or Sweden, the nature of business, civil society, labor, and state has always been critical to development. But that creates coherence. It ensures that you are mobilizing all resources towards an agenda. So civil society, private businesses, labor, government, political parties must have a partnership that's built on this shared notion of development. We won't agree on all the issues, but they will all agree that this country needs to move from being a beggarly indebted country to one that can feed, take care of itself, produce high quality goods and services, and impact the life of. So civil society must be, but it must be civil society reworked to now work with the state.
And that's the question I want to get in before I go to elections and politics and all of that. You worked for Gani Fawehinmi, you worked in Olisa Bakoba's chambers, that was like the melting pot of the activism of the 80s, 90s that led to a return to democracy, etc. The kind of dynamism we saw in those years, we don't see them today with civil society. What has happened? And how do we recalibrate back to that? First of all, maybe even going back a little historically, what got us to that point? What got us to the point where civilians had the guts to face off against the military? Yeah. And today, when these same civilians are facing off against civilian politicians, the civilian activists seem to have been defined. What is it that happened? Because if we don't understand what has happened, we can't solve for it. And afterwards, we can go to politics.
Yeah, well, first, the military rule was a blessing in disguise, but we did use it well, like everyone else. So we had this terrible time that conscientized, using the language of society, conscientized everybody. If you look at that period, we had a partnership between labor, student activists, NGOs, and politicians. So we faced, and that's one thing about development. So oftentimes, you may need a calamity to push you to that level of cognition, or you need leaders who walk you up, narratives to that level. So military rule walked us to a level where it was clear to everybody that we need to dismantle the military and regain democracy. So civil society, judiciary is the same. Supreme Court, with all the decrees, all the recklessness, all the terror, if you look at the quality of decisions by the Supreme Court, challenging, maneuvering through the privative decrees to still assert their independence. So people say, the Supreme Court of 1980s, great Supreme Court, courageous, a mix of risk, but that's the nature of this. It's just like any other country. In time of war, in time of calamity, people become heroic, ready to fight. So we got that. But at the end of that, there was a conversation. Should we join politics or not? So people say, no. So they moved away. Now, look at the seduction and the problem. We're a democracy, and democracy presents itself as normality, as legitimacy. So the messaging, the narrative is not there. The consciousness, it's difficult for me to mobilize you, Patrick, and say, look, we are dead. The answer to this challenge is for us to go hit to Aso and find the president right there. If we die, we die. That message will be very, very not credible. Why? because we can phantom several intervention points. The parties are there, National Assembly is there, PDP Governors Forum, APC, several things. So we call it democratic intercession. In a democracy, you're not asked to be an intercessor. You go and plead, you write petition, you write articles. So that's part of the problem. But then it can be, so that's a crisis we're in, that we are now in a democracy where we have been so flagellized and, flattened out, that we now find apertures, small apertures of engagement. So you vote, if you don't vote, you talk to your LP, talk to your, so that's what changed. But again, also what changed, it reflected the weakness of our civil society as well, because we're not, we didn't prepare for democracy. We didn't understand the project nation building beyond military rule. Military rule helped to foster unity, helped to foster some kind of, unanimity in terms of vision. Democracy now or never. And of course, the West, again, it can never talk about development outside the external factor. The external factor, the way the globe is shaping it. At the earlier age of promotion of democracy, the USA, all this platform, it was very easy and coherent for them. So those guys who are fighting military rule, that's the guys we're going to support. So we have support, they arrest you, they declare you prisoner of conscience. Even if Abuja, somehow you get some mention. But now we have elected leaders. So the guys in Washington are struggling with, is Tinubu legitimate or not legitimate? And so there is no external support base so the whole thing now fragments into different things, some for Tinubu, some against Tinubu, some for development, for some all kinds of things. The military rule was clear cut, and that's also a moment how the event happens. If we had mobilized at that moment, perhaps we'd be in a different trajectory.
Is there a moment now to mobilize around poverty, hardship, etc., to then compel the leadership of Nigeria to think more deep, much deeper about the challenges and the solutions? By the way, to be very clear, there are no easy answers. It's not like the problem started with the Tinubu administration. It's something that's been building up for decades. So this is not really about who's in power today, but it's about a thinking. Because when you talk about development planning, it's not the document. It's a developmental mindset that says we must develop, right? But you can't get Rams to vote for Salah. You can't get, politicians and the political elite and even the business elite, who are profiting from the system to on their own think of new ways of doing it differently. So does the moment present itself for somebody to galvanize a people, to force the elite class to start thinking critically about development?
Yes, the moment and the man can meet, but again, moments are constructed. Yes, I agree with you. The incidents are here, but construction is the problem. So take, for example, electoral crisis we're in now. The crisis of development, that's clear. Crisis of nationhood, and even crisis of nationality. All these are raw materials that maybe a select group can put together. The key thing will be, are they able to create a national constitution? It doesn't have to be everybody stamping. So I'm even thinking around the intervention I did on election, which went viral. I said, can't I build on it and develop an action plan? 12 basic things that must be done. Go to the Council of State members to sign up to it. Go to the former president. So you can actually, there are many ways which you can create a groundswell. The three critical things will be clarity as to what you're presenting. What's the problem that we have? There are many problems, but how do you define it? And how do you create a knock-on effect? That 2-3 major things that have the effect of knocking things off and knocking them together. And then can you now identify people and build strong narrative and support for it? Can you also counter the scattering waves, partisan politics, 2007 is here, the high-pitch Igbo Yoruba, Twitter war, different things that are negative that are trying to. So if you can kind of maneuver over those things and create that, then you can create a moment in which even the Tinubu himself comes to a point where everybody says, look, this is actually the only direction for us. And there's enough holding environment to sustain that move. The trick for me is, I think that development is ultimately managerial, which means the theories are there, but if you look at the history, you discover that what changed everything is the ability of leaders to first understand what should be done. The theory tells you why we are poor, okay? The theory tells you how you can grow your economy. But then they need to take those theories and then diagnose the problem, diagnose the moment, the institutions they face, the helps, the enablement, and the structure, and then be able to think creatively as to how they can move from A to B. So this moment is still, every moment is potentially a moment to construct a developmental agenda. But the question is, some moments are very persuasive because of cataclysmic effects, war, tragedies, things happen. They say a crisis is a victim to waste. So crisis helps you tell the story powerfully. It helps people to listen and push people to agree. But you can also simulate a crisis. Leadership is, that's why leadership is narrative, it's communication. It doesn't mean they have to be an orator. It's ability to make people see what they have not seen, cognitive clarity. They see it and they see the challenge, they see the direction. We can do that.
Let's bring it home. Let's bring it home. I suspect you're a member of the Labour Party, and because I know you've tried to run for governor of Imo State, and I think, if I remember correctly, it was under the Labour Party. Last election, a lot of almost pan-Nigerian support for the party. And then after the elections, the party is almost imploding, right? What? And this is for a discussion we're having here as to building a movement, etc. Why is it that something like the Labour Party that built some traction hasn't been able to hold it together for a year? And you want us to believe that we can construct this narrative and manage it and do X, Y, Z, but the one we have, we can do nothing with.
Very good question and very good basis for pessimism, but I would say no, two different things. First, Labour Party was never built. Labour Party was another opportunism. Maybe if we worked, assuming Mr. P2P finally won the election with the Labour Party, then the building starts. You see, people talk about history can be accidental. Something happens. So assuming Peter jump in and then people, the reception, the so-called obedient movement showed the appetite for transformation, even though not well thought out. Again, this is what's happening. Many revolutions are accidental, but some people sit together and put things together and harness them to achieve more sustained gain. So Labour Party was a claptrap. In fact, my only sense that the smaller parties are worse than the big parties for a very clear reason, economic. The big parties have people who have trade-offs. So if you're chairman, they ask you, don't take the position, come down. You know that you can become minister, you can become contract, but you're a Labour or IPP, NAPP or whatever party it is, your only economic gain is doing primaries, take money. So if they want to push you out to where, there's nothing they can give you in place. So that's why the crisis becomes endemic. So what you have in Labour Party is a party where Mr. P2B kind of mobilize it to use to do that, intervention was a risky, it was a yeoman adventure to go and capture power. If I had captured power, maybe we would have left the Labour Party or rebuilt the Labour Party, and that's where the building starts. So the question we would have asked ourselves now is, can we have and as a point, Okonkwo made a few days ago, he says, you want election finished, people start talking about merger. No, he said what he should have done is to build the movement. Two different things. So if the Labour leaders came together with some of the PDP and other people, and they start building disobedient, whatever you call it, movement as a real opposition, grounded. Yes, selfish, humans are selfish. Everybody want power, maybe money, but grounded in some clear concept of development and politics. Then they are building. That's where it's happening. So we didn't build Labour Party. Maybe they can now build a movement. But again, this pessimism, this failure should not, the script is the same everywhere in the world. The question is, do we have the moment converging? The moment, the human beings, the psychology, the sentiment. So there's the unknown, the X factor about development, that unknown could be psychological. It could be people's way of life. It could be people's loss of activism, heroism, loss of faith in public value, loss of even volunteerism. There may be that X factor that makes a difference between how the same events will be weaponized, used by people in Ghana and Nigeria. So yes, what happened in the last election with the Labour Party was an opportunity to, even the leaders of Labour Party, when I said, look, we can actually capture power in 2022. So why don't we basically, like me, I almost, but they wanted me to chair the idea of the Electoral Commission, which I sold to them. But at this point, I said, look, this party has no credibility. For me to be the chairman of the Electoral Committee, which I sold them, with a party that has no credibility. So it has no traction with the people. I saw to you when he had credibility. So let's put a pan-Nigerian Electoral Reform Commission. You're asking me not to be the chairman of what will not have a capability. So I think the real problem is that, look, we are being dragged down by a particular, and that's why I say politics is king, the incentive structure of the political system. If it's not possible for idealists who come together to build a country, to win election, to win power, and they're always tempted to jump out and win power, hoping that entrism, when they're there, that's maybe the perennial problem.
Sure.
There must be a structure that incentivizes this long walk to freedom, this hard work, this building. People have faith that, look, when we build, we can win. That will sustain the building.
And for our listeners, we're going to open it up for questions. Please use the Q&A tab to type your question. I'll read it out and attribute the question to you, and our guests will have an opportunity to respond. But Sam, I'm happy that you've come to elections, and I'd like to talk a little bit about elections, because we can't really hold the political class accountable unless we have credible elections. I don't know if you saw the report by the Athena Center, Ostachidoka's think tank, that showed that after reviewing data from 3 off-cycle elections, that about 80% of the votes cast were really credible. The rigging happened in about 20% of the cases, and it was mostly in the local government areas controlled by the incumbent. Which, as bad as that may sound, gives me hope, because prior to that report, one thought that it was just massive rigging all the way. So in your thinking about electoral reforms, what are some of the practical things you're considering that could give us elections that have more integrity, especially in light of what we've seen, that the lift is heavy, but not as heavy as we thought initially?
Good point. I would like to look at 4 things. First is political parties. The Supreme Court further damaged the idea of democratic evolution by thinking around, the party is sovereign, therefore party decides, and the Supreme Court mistakes the party to be the people run the party. So in the Supreme Court's idea of party sovereignty, if Mr. Patrick Okigbo is the chairman, Patrick Okigbo writes that Sam Amadi is a candidate, that's the party. But that's not what it is. Party supremacy is that the party has a structure, and the party, the state will not dictate to the party, but the party has to follow its rules. So I want to see more of judicial review. That means the party is regulated, and that's actually what INEC is supposed to do. Again, I think that in a country like Nigeria, you need to regulate democracy. You need to nurture it to grow. Because you don't have the environment is not. Democracy depends on some cultural, social values, civic responsibility, and civic power. We have societies where people can be punished, people can exert accountability, without the state, without police. We don't have that. So you don't have to regulate those behavior. So if you say people should form political parties, form parties, then they have rules and regulations. So you cannot say the mighty can shrug them off, then therefore. So I think that's number one thing that's important. We need to be clear that there must be structure in the party so that the party has life, democratized. We don't need to impose on the party, but the party must be responsible and disciplined. Sure. INEC has a responsibility. That's my word to INEC. INEC leaves its job. The party regulation work, INEC doesn't do it. Second, I want to see technology that we used before. Like you said, you're right. Elections would have been almost 80%, 90% perfect if INEC didn't make the mistake of shutting down the server. And because look, you need a drama to happen. So imagine if the ruling party lost election in this time, and some governors lost election because they couldn't manipulate the system. So that would have sent a signal. You see, it's about signaling to people that, look, accountability is real. When you're there, you can be voted out. It has very strong implication. And so that's where I think we're failing. So we need to have that that clarity as to transmission. We repaired why the election was easily not rigged was because of beavers.
Yeah.
So beavers created a control. So
Yeah.
if you match it with electronic transmission, we get home. That should be clear. The third area, judiciary, is the problem in my view too. Because look at Kogi, look at Imo. Those are decisions that are almost stupid. Kogi own tribunal says, oh yes, give an order, come. They invited the INEC to bring the beavers, and they demonstrated before court, and it shows the result. The same tribunal went and says it's illegal evidence. Why? That the person should have been foreclosed. The court ordered, and so they have used the Evidence Act, Electoral Evidence Procedure, to commit crime against the people. So I think the judiciary must now, there should be more accountability. I mean, you have to be careful with the judiciary because even in the US, you can't just intervene. You can't say, let's regulate them. But there must be a way that the new legal MBA, and I'm working on that, should put more pressure for judges to understand the basics of electoral jurisprudence. I mean, there's old corruption, which is the big thing here. I mean, it's not for nothing that the biggest bribe taker is now the judiciary officially based on the report from NBS and the UN drug organization. So, but the key point I'm making is that the judiciary must then sit up to say it's our responsibility to protect democratic right of the people. So we care about the outcome of the election. The accuracy matters to us. And if you can do that, and you see that many people lost election and the court confirmed that, you will see that the incentive structure, and that gets back to what Paul Collier wrote about criminalizing the electoral system. If you allow the criminalization of the electoral system to go ahead, like I said, bribe INEC, bribe judiciary, there's no hope for democracy because the worst of us, a criminal system does a natural selection. So only those who are skilled in the craft of criminality would triumph. So you see the genius in crime becoming everything because you can't work that system. And so my concern is that the electoral system must decriminalize the electoral system. Electoral reform must decriminalize the electoral system. And the judiciary has a role to play so that we see the court punish impunity. Then it makes the cost of impunity higher. And it makes it less likely that people are going to go out to invest because this is about economics. They're going to spend a lot of money to rig elections, but if those money will come to naught because the courts will throw them away, then you see a reduction. Like I said, electoral reform, what we now need is, can PDP, APC, Labour, all these parties, opposition parties come together and present a unified, including legislators, and say, this is what we demand. But again, the free rider problem, some of the people in power think that this new INEC will help us. The last point for me is that you can't have this INEC guarantee free and fair election. So you have to go back to Ways report and say, between an election, can we construct an INEC that has two characteristics? One, that is not directly appointed by presidents, which will be a tough one for them. Two, that has stakeholder participation. So the parties who are actors have their representatives in that process. And again, and I've written this severally, rulemaking procedure by INEC has to be like a regulator. So it's made on reason, on paper, on evidence, so that if you have stakeholders in that room where they make decisions, it'll be more rigorous, more accurate decision, and nobody would, build its electoral strategy on buying off the INEC chairman or buying off an INEC commissioner or INEC resident commissioner to win an election, because the procedure for decision making is one that is quasi-judicial, and stakeholders are part of that decision-making process.
Exactly. And in your response, you touched on a question we just got from a Joshua Ode, where he wanted to know, how do you make INEC independent? Because if INEC is not independent, they're not able to deliver elections with integrity. But I think you already talked about that by talking about the Ways report and other recommendations. But maybe you have another point on that.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, so independence will depend on two things: appointment, but that's not enough. So even if the plaintiff appoints, if the election process doesn't allow you to control the decision, meaning it's open, transparent, it involves interest holders, so you find it difficult to manipulate. So what I want to see is two levels. Appointment is important, but beyond that, or if it's not possible because of politics, we should have an INEC that have clear procedure for rulemaking, and any rules made conduct that is voided. So it opens it up for us to see what they're saying. Stakeholders, the APC will be there, Labour Party will be there for those decisions, and they know that you can't make those decisions secretly. So if you create the same level of accountability that we place on top level regulators all over the world, you know when the Fed will meet, you know when they vote, you see the record of voting, you know who voted. Even the central bank here would meet and announce how they voted, that they voted 3-2 for this policy. This is a rational, you may not agree with the policy, but you know that they voted, who voted, how they voted. So we should do the same way. The INEC should be a place where, not that INEC has announced, INEC should have hearings, and the people who sit there should include party reps who are there to canvass and argue. I know that the INEC chairman or the commissioners voted. So with that, it increases the cost of bribing INEC, but there's no point bribing the chairman who has to go through a procedure that is clear and everybody can see and question. That's the point I'm making.
Or who is even compelled to go through that procedure and knows that, you know, they would suffer some kind of legal.
Exactly. And if they fail, they can be pitched, they can be doing, exactly. That's the point. There must be a cost. There must be a commitment, process, and consequence for failure.
Okay. Let me shift gears a little bit. And first of all, say that it's ideas that rule the world. It's ideas that shape societies. And on account of that, to thank you for starting the Abuja School of Political and Social Thought. But to really understand what you're hoping to achieve with this think tank in light of developing Nigeria. So if you can kind of, in a very short response, tell us what you're hoping that the school achieves as we go along this development path.
Yeah, the Abuja School started as a joke. We started conversing with Tudenta, we're looking at books and said, but look, two things are important for development, and you mentioned it. It's the ideas. People assume that we say, okay, institutions matter, but institutions differ according to the quality of the ideas behind them. You have bad institutions and good institutions. So there's this notion that, oh, we need institutions to develop. Is what kind of institutions? So the Abuja School's premise is that there are bad social science analysis and good ones. There are bad ideas and therefore bad policies. And our job is therefore to say, we say beyond orthodoxy, to first rigor, look at the issue. What is the problem? And try to look at the ideas that are defining those problems. And we feel that, generally speaking, globally, that the world has come to a point of new ideas, a threshing floor for getting a new idea. You see, if you look at the debate, whether it's the left liberal, right liberal, we are run out of ideas. The ideas are no longer kind of fit for the world we're entering. So there's now a competition for the new ideas. What are the new ideas that will change the way we live our life and that will also solve the problems we have? It's not about innovation. It's also about wisdom, ability to solve this problem. You can innovate and create more problems. AI is innovation, but people might see a lot of problems. So the Abuja School's niche is to say that we are going beyond orthodoxy. We are looking at this as again and rethinking and saying, wait a minute, what's going on here? Can we offer a transformative idea? That's one. Two, we also feel there's a sense for an Africanist perspective, not necessarily harken back to African exceptionalism or Africanism in terms of culture, but to say that we in this part of the world also have a voice, not just a voice advocacy in NGO, but a voice in ideas. So we want to also create new wave of ideas that maybe in the next 20 years, 30 years, the people in the global north will be seeing those ideas as actually redemptive. Today we talk about some Western thinkers that have whose ideas have helped. I did a lecture which you saw on social science matters. Yeah, we see transformative moments. So Abuja School thinks that we can bring together thinkers, scholars, professionals, and recreate the incentive and nobility again of thinking. It's not thinking is now no longer noble because there's no, where's the money? Show me the money. So we think that maybe we can remodel the nobility of thinking.
That is quite.
Yes, that's the point.
That is quite Socratic. You know, this idea that you sit, you think, and you come up with something, and then society can run with it. Is that really the case? Is the case that for us, not in the West, you know, where because again in the West you have the thinkers, but you also have the bureaucracy that can actually action it. But if in our case we do not have that second level, is it enough to just stay at the top level, come up with the ideas and leave it hanging. Would that work?
No, it won't work. I mean, and let me tell you this story. When I was going to law school, going to university, UNN, before I left, I wanted to study philosophy. My uncle, Nano Kebu, told me, say, no, philosophy is the days of Plato. So in those days, these are Abuja. They have peasants who are farming for them. And so today's philosophy is functional. It told me that in law, you will meet philosophy. I think probably it was wise. So when I went to do graduate work at Harvard, I focused a lot on philosophy. And I discovered that even as a lawyer, so that's the point you're making. The Nigerian intellectual, the African intellectual, has also to be by nature, by the force of circumstance, a technocrat, a businessman, a bureaucrat. And again, we have examples in history. Machiavelli, some of these guys, we are all and out public servants who worked in the public service, served the prince, and then discovered and then wrote about how prince can triumph. So I think we ought to be in the mode of the Machiavelli, in the mode of some of the scholars, even people like Adam Smith. Some of them held positions in the economy and then reflected. So yes, we can't just say, okay, let's think. Somebody will think, run with it. We will think and probably pray that we'll be the one who will run with it. And again, we also think for the world. So people in the world can recycle it back to us as a development initiative, and people will run with it.
And I think there are people who are doing interesting work in looking at what's happening in Nigeria and Africa. One of my guests on this show is Portia Roloffs. She did some good work on good governance in Nigeria and looked at the Lagos model. You know, is there something that's happening in Lagos and Western and Southwest Nigeria where, in spite of all the corruption and so on, they were able to eke out some development? And I think that's the kind of work that you're talking about.
Yeah, exactly. In fact, it's surprising. 1956, I think, there's a guy called P.T. Bao, one of the leading neoclassical economists, challenging this planning. His work was in Nigeria. He showed Nigerian Hausa communities, Igbo, Bini, how economy thrived. His argument was, look, without government, things work. So he was challenging these planning theories. I said, look, guys, look at Nigeria. So I agree with you. Again, the more serious work should be work that is empirical as well as theoretical. So you look at things, you see how they work, you try to test your analysis with situations. And I think, again, very important, many of us smart people, especially social sciences and economics, have migrated to the West. It has left our situation understudied. And if you are understudied, you will likely not have good enough solutions. So I think there should be a wave back where the African intellectuals, thinkers, scholars are now thinking about our situation and using those tools, those analyses from the West and our own to integrate and be able to fashion out, a way out for us. So we need to have more of African-oriented scholars, not Africanists, but African-oriented scholars.
And so in your engagements at the Africa School, have you arrived at something? Are you guys still tinkering with it? I mean, I know that like Claude Ake and Walter Rodney and so on, you have very publicly blamed Africa's de-development to just wholesome adoption of Western liberal thought. Have you arrived at something? You started working on conceptual incoherence. Is there something there that we can begin to think of? I think around.
Yes, what we have arrived is that three things. First is that Africa has good intellectual materials to build a future. But again, it's not a case of Africa would have done well, but for the colonial intervention. But that's not the point. The point is that we are worse off now than we were before colonial intervention. Before colonial intervention, we were on an evolutionary trend. We had robust but maybe weak structures that are adapting. But this disruption now has cast us in nowhere, in a zone of nowhere. We're neither Westernized nor Africanized. So what we have fashioned out is that the Africa can provide a third way, a narrative around beyond the neo-Marxist and neo-capitalist, if you like, neoliberal, okay? Something that is communitarian, but essentially borrows or adapts, affirms, not even borrow, because most of the things that the neo-Marxists talk about can be affirmed from an African perspective. And some of the things that neoliberals talk about can be affirmed. So our sense is that that third way could actually be is the way we are moving to affirm the theories and the propositions from these two divides, and saying that we can merge them with authentic African communitarian value and present an economic, especially economic. Our sense that economy, we're going back to political economy. Economy should be political economy, and it should be the central concern of Africa, political economy. Everything should be, part of that political economy. So it's not economics, econometrics, it's political economy, including social science, sociology, law, everything. But the essential thing is, how do we enhance the capacity of the African state to produce? I like the way Lewis put it, says, economizing to produce highest value at the least cost, whether it's social cost of the environment, whether it's financial cost or cost of sustainability, but highest value for lowest cost.
Fantastic. And I hear Peter Lewis is working on another book. We can't wait for it to come out. He did a great job with Growing Apart. I have a question from Chukwemeka Ekesiobi. He said, our jurisprudence has to move beyond the law as it is to how it ought to be. How can our electoral law make this movement?
Well, jurisprudence is not just law. Jurisprudence is a theory about what the law should be like, plug into legal theory, philosophy, and all that. So our law, again, laws, they say, is what the judges say they are. So if you improve the understanding of judges and enhance legal scholarship, again, that's part of, I'm now the chairman of a new committee set up by the new NBA president called Adjudicature Review Committee, which I crafted the name, of course. And I said, look, the problem of the judiciary is not just corruption, that's a big one, but it's also a problem of learning, problem of cognition and theorizing. What should be the role of judiciary in a democracy? How should we interpret electoral rules? How should we manage electoral conflicts? So these things are not cast in stone. You see, again, the social scientists tell us that the whole legal instrument, political instrument, these things are constituted by ideas. We constitute them. So it's not like law is cut and dry, put there. The law is, there's no law. Law is that dialectics between the text, the judge, the litigants, the thinkers, the commentators, everybody, and what you get is now law. So jurisprudence is ahead of law. It creates law. It helps law. It's an interpretation of law, and it's an expression of what law should be. So judges in Nigeria need not just moral, situation, corruption. No, it's also about learning. And again, look, let's be very sincere. Our education has fallen. Legal education is in crisis. Our judges are picked from among us. Many of them poorly educated. Unfortunately, that's what it is. But most of us, almost all of us, are now poorly educated by virtue of our environment. So you need to upgrade their thinking as well and their understanding about this crisis, because the crisis of justice in Nigeria today is not the same as 1960. I mean, the mere change in our environment, technology, has changed issues of what is right and just. Think about regulation, simple economic regulation. The way we used to be in 1960 or 1920s with this local technology. It's not the way you can do with today's technology. The ability to construct and remake a human being means that jurisprudence has to upgrade. So if in the past we say, oh, it doesn't matter, technology should run, but now we can't say that. Are we making that migration in terms of knowledge? So that's also something to work on, so that judges understand what these changes mean for the old question of justice, fairness, and equity.
And because you touched on corruption, I found your paper, The Failure of Anti-Corruption Campaigns as a Failure of Law Reforms in Nigeria. I found it very interesting, an interesting read. And there you try to situate overt focus on law enforcement versus change management as the reason why we haven't been able to make much progress with our anti-corruption campaigns. If you can help us unpack that thinking here and maybe a way forward.
Well, I started that paper looking at 1955, I think, in Northern Nigeria House of Assembly, where Gwandu talked about corruption. The same thing we'll talk about today.
Yeah.
And then look at the Zig and so the question then is that, of course, corruption is not solved anywhere in the world permanently. But if you look at it from the perspective of law enforcement, somebody commit a crime and prosecute him, of course, that's true. But the real thing is, like, as a change management, the structure, and people have argued that you can't talk about corruption in a feudal states because it looks like corruption as a discourse emerged now that we are looking at a country with egalitarianism, where individuals have rights, different between state and society. So the king in the village who owns the wife and the coconut and the cocoyam cannot be corrupt because it's matter of fact, he has to take it. So this then means that you have to change the society, the structure, the ideas, the collective action, the what they call expectations. For example, what they call social compact. People expect that, look, this new job you are holding, this is expectation. You're going to do this. So why do we don't even question our? I mean, look at the public service. Look at the discretionary approvals. Nobody questions them. Nobody asks you to retire security money because how can you retire security money? So those are constructs that mean that you have to move beyond legal prosecution to change management, to changing attitude, changing structure, creating new expectation, managing processes, and enhancing oversight. So, for example, if you require that Minister of Finance publishes, like I give example, publishes a budget for local government on newspaper, and there's no normative expectation that people would question local government chairman over the years, what's the point? So you have followed what some people call asomorphic, mimicry. You have followed the fact that you publish it, but the underwriting norms and cultural behavior that should support that is not existence. Or but you can go ahead and educate the people, help build up constituencies in the local government that whistleblowers help change the rules, allow them to go to court, for example, and demand the local government chairman to submit the report. I give an example. Campaign finance, I went to INEC, wrote to them, make clear rules about how parties report on finance donation. They didn't do that. I went to court, got an order. Now, if INEC was reporting that, you can now look at the documents and say, but if you don't allow them to make those commitments, then there's no way you can do oversight. That's the problem with I try to present. So if the parties don't have obligation to keep record of every donation, then you already compromise 50% the process of campaign financing. But there's no way I know who donated. But if you have to keep record, it puts you under pressure to tell less lies because the records can nail you and somebody can go to jail. Why are politicians being prosecuted abroad? Because there's a record. And that record flows from obligation to keep record first. So I'm telling INEC, create those reporting mandates. So the parties report those. Then you can go and say, so they may lie, but each lie requires more lies, and then the cost of lying may be too high, and somehow somebody can dictate. But so that's the point I'm saying. Leave law enforcement, follow change management procedure, you get more results.
Okay, and I like the example you use with the local government, which can also be the same example with like the Nigeria Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative, where the fundamental thinking was shine a light on the corruption, publish it, the people will take it and run. It has never happened in Nigeria. So is it that we really do not want to see corruption end? Because we're all waiting for our own turn to eat? Or is it that we have become so jaded that we don't believe any of this would work? Or is it that what we're trying to push as anti-corruption is so alien a practice to where we are, our social norms, our social values, our cultural experiences? If we don't understand what's at the root of this, how do we then create a solution to the problem?
Okay, so let's take Singapore. I'm sure if you look at Singapore's own law, and the law is not just the paper, they would have marshaled out strategy to find out who is not reporting. Not just saying, they also followed a strategy to ensure that within the timeline, those reports will be taken to either administrative tribunal or some enforcement procedure. So the difference here is incompleteness is a problem of development. Okay. So in contract, the economists argue that the reason why we do regulations, contracts are incomplete. So contracts cannot foresee risk, whether they will fall tomorrow, whether earthquake, whether a plane will fall. So you build in that contract that is not complete. Therefore, there's a regulator. So what we are doing with development is an incomplete development. So you have done 80. They go and do the work and report. But you don't care about that report. That report is down there, reference, bring to the media. So the question then is ask yourself, what next? What is there any agency, anybody, any person, any process, any procedure that ensures that that report, what do you want to make out of it? And that's why we argue that all developed economies, and later the development economies, are in essence planned economies. You see, plan is not distortive pricing. This question you ask now. So when I publish the report that shows that this is the outcome, so what? Who should we motivate to take it up? Whether it's private agents, whether it's non-profit. Are they organized? What do we do to organize them? What key information do they have? So if a country publishes the local government report, who in the local government, how can we help NGOs there to begin to use those reports, go to marketplaces and say, this is actually what is happening? If you don't do that, and that's what I call development. So you must drill down and drill up. You must have the policy, the bureaucracy. Those gaps are too many. And because those gaps exist, the efforts are wasted. So yes, it might be that some people don't even want to fight corruption, but even those who think they want to. And that's why, Patrick, we have a large knowledge gap globally, but more so here. I mean, so development for learning, what doesn't work. So it's not enough to say, okay, we'll copy this policy there. But do you have the institutions that drive the same thing? Other people say, okay, the policy, the bureaucracy. So Singapore is not like us. Everything is detailed. Maybe there's somebody who is watching that thing and ensuring that that report, once it drops down, in the next 2 weeks, some Amadi will be issued a summon to explain. And in 2-3 weeks, there will be a conclusion of that case. Some Amadi goes to prison or is free. Closure. In our own, that report will sit in the villa. So you don't have rules, small letter rules, procedures that explains how something moves from the villa to the president and to the action authority and how long. So in other words, I think that the work of development is so tasking and tiring that only few nations, I've always argued, if you look at history, only few nations enter that narrow corridor, like references. That narrow corridor requires diligence. It requires you have to cross the T's and dot the I's, and that's where we're missing. So there's incompleteness in the structure of development, and that's what we're getting.
I want to stay on this a little bit, just for maybe 2 more minutes. Why do we have that incompleteness? Why is it that we don't follow, that today we don't follow through? But in the 60s, we followed through better. So in the 60s, 70s, we could still follow through, right? What has happened? How fundamental is that change? Is there any pathway out of it, or is this like path dependency now? Are we stuck? Is it a self-fulfilling prophecy? If it is not, how do we begin to, because this is where you now move the dark clouds, right? If it is not, how do we begin to change what, it wasn't perfect in the 60s, don't get me wrong, I'm not glorifying the past, but I'm saying we, the same human beings, we could do it. What has changed, and how do we at least get back to the 60s and begin our growth, truncated growth process?
Well, first, you're right. I mean, in the 60s, what has changed is span of attention. Leaders had depth, deeper, I don't mean in terms of qualification, of course, they're on the whole better qualified, whether in terms of people like Abubakar Tafawa Balewa or the northern leader may not have gone to Oxford or Harvard, but have been village chiefs.
The mind was exposed. The mind was
educated.
They
were village chiefs. They walked through the process. They were administrators. So they were very, very fortified. That's one. So again, they also had depth. They looked down. They span of attention. They paid attention. They didn't have to zone out and take their attention big. That's the problem. Democracy has zoned it out, and it's no longer. So we are seeing the whole landscape. We're not picking the pieces. So to be a governor, look at every time a governor has to fly to somewhere, attend this, go to the UN, go to this place, the place is in China. Those are nonsense. And that's the truth about it. And that's why these Asian leaders were different. The work of paying attention is so huge. You have to zone in the lens downwards and pick those pieces. So that's what I've changed. We have zoned out our attention and we can pick the little things that matter. And that's development. In fact, development is about those little things. If you don't pick them, there's a book many years ago, 1982, published by James Scott, called Thinking Like a State. Why schemes designed to improve human condition has failed. It was an anthropology sociologist, great book. And he made a point that metis, local knowledge. Now, what that means that grand ideas without paying attention to metis, local knowledge. If you see those who have worked hard, like the Chinese, we can now look at their theory and give a theory. But actually, they didn't start from theory. They started from understanding their situation, designing it, have an idea, and push. So if you look at what they did, there's more of granular.
Correct.
And less of grand.
Correct.
Now we're dealing with UN, this. So leaders are zoning out, they're not zoning in. That's a problem. So how do we not get back to that? Like I said, things have changed, but the principle will remain the same. That somehow, imagine having a government where you are bureaucratic. So you have more people who are dealing with things at the local level, at the granular, issue-based. And then the practice run up and down. Then that's how to deal with that deficit. So you are now in a world where UN is calling you, AU is calling you, this person is calling you. None of this is translate to real, and then you don't even know what's going on. So how you constitute the government now, more technocratic, more grand level based, more engagement with the people, more understanding of things, focus groups may help you bridge that gap.
And we must give President Tinubu credit for at least trying to move governance down to the local government level, so with the new law, etc. Although we're seeing that in practice again, it is a challenge because the state governors who are now trying to run elections are also hijacking that process. So the state governors, yes, there's going to be some election, but it's going to be people who they handpick. Just taking this particular example now, moving power to the local government, how could we have navigated it better to ensure that the people who emerge as councillors, as local government chairmen, are representative of where the people really are? And these are people who can really drive development at that local level.
Okay, so if I've used first, federalism, that's why I talk about institutions. So federalism has its own issue with development.
By the way, Sam, let me interject here because there's a question from one of our listeners, Opeyemi A. He says, does Mr. Amadi find the local government law problematic as a lawyer? So maybe you can handle it.
I can start with that. Yes, I find it. You see, I think it's a band-aid, but it's wrong. See, the notion of government should be federalism, federal state. So if we are running federal state or federal local, but we have this oddity of federal state local government. Now, what we have done is to federalize local government, which is also an intervention. Maybe it may be right from a project management perspective because you don't have the proper structure. What we should have had is local government working with states. People talk about the US where you have counties, but they're not, it's not the US government that manage them. Many of those local authorities are created by local state laws, okay? So I'm in support of local authority, but I think they should not be federalized, so it's problematic. And I think that we're not going to get the result. You see, you hit the point. Now, you've told them they have got, only thing I've done is to transfer their resources to them. But the structure for managing the place, the Constitution says that the local government will be as defined by state laws. So the basic thing is not the money. In fact, we have now replaced 36 strong investment centers with 774 plus 36 investment centers. So now people are running for local government chairman who would have been running for governor or senator because you have resources there. So I think that the process is not the right one. I'm not sure whether you're hearing me.
I can hear you. I'm with you.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So the point I make is that the result we want to get, we will not get it because, okay, think about this way. If I was President Tinubu, I would think around financial incentives. So, for example, mobilize the World Bank or these grant makers and provide structure of local government you want to see before you get a grant or you get this funding. Not just in terms of financial independence, you give the money, no. The quality of elections, how you set up your electoral system, administrative procedure, things like accountability profile. So the key thing is that you want to use federal power to push for grant level operation. And it's very important. The federal government cannot succeed except local governments are working in some measure. That's the reason why we don't have development in this part of in Nigeria. If you look at China, look at these places. How would the Chinese government succeed in this economic miracle if they don't have control over the productive functions of the regions? They set up enterprise zones. They give some people capacity to produce more than they should. So they have capacity to shift the things to serve agenda. You can't develop where you have 36 centers doing different things. So I would want beyond the court saying, because now the court have said so, they're setting up a committee with the governor to negotiate entry point to even give the money. And so it end up back to politics. The government used to extract commitment. They used to say, okay, if you're going to support us 2027, we leave everything. Things like that. That's not development. That's politics. So I would have preferred to go a different route of using granting aid, structuring financial support, even getting all the grantors abroad, World Bank, IMF, all these guys agreeing to a set of, that's leadership. So this is a set of conditions we must give to states. And that condition is that we want to see a process where all you want is that the local governments are working, functioning, and that the finances are open for us. We don't care who keeps the account. We want to make sure that those funds committed to projects are delivered and records are sent and verifiable. If you extract that, if you don't agree, you won't get any of this extra constitutional financial support. That will work faster than what they're going through. So yes, I think that you have to get the money to the local government. I'm sure it's used, but the vehicle for doing that is stuck right now. It's going to end up with a good deal. Yeah.
So Sam, I set out to figure out if you're a good rainmaker, or in this case, a cloud mover, if you can help us reimagine, Nigeria's future. I think you've done, you've concocted yourself well. But is there any question that I've not asked, some point, another little, talisman you've got in your bag that you haven't shared, that you would...
Well, I think you've done a great job, but maybe for time we would have looked at, the other time I wrote about a new compact for development, which is what I'm talking about. So the question people are asking is, what are the things we can do to make government, focus on this? And I said, look at chapter 2, it creates a basic of economic citizenship that could be a basis to recreate the Nigerian state so that people can make demands beyond ethnicity and the government will feel an obligation. So I think that what can help us with this political trap, could be economic citizenship. And that basically says that, look, people understand, look at the poverty, the inflation, the hunger, the fuel crisis. So can National Assembly, can we, civil society, draw up a process in which there's a commitment to deliverables, commitment to using resources to improve the life of the people, local level, at different levels. And that constitutes some kind of, it's legal, but at the same time programmatic, at the same time civic. People sign on to this, our template for assessment. And this is the basis which we advocate for. So it has a transformative capacity for those who are leading, apart from the normal people want to steal money. But again, it gives me a sense that the people contract with them on this basis. And this is not like theoretical. This is basically that you take it to the grassroots. People are saying, this is what we want from government. And the government says that what the people are asking for are basically economic. The thing about the economic issues that they have a way of mobilizing people beyond rhetoric. So if you're talking about access to healthcare, so those who don't believe in liberalism or believe in X or Y can really understand why they need to have functional healthcare. We cannot talk about whether it should be free, paid for, whether it should be socialized, different things. So I thought that if we really begin to now functionalism, so look, there's a reason why we have government. The Constitution has helped us by providing basic postulates of how government should act. Can we vitalize it? Can we give it life and put it in a form that is both a citizen's demand? It become what the NGOs, what NLC is saying. If you're responding to the fuel crisis, you're not responding that why should that go to end pay? You're responding to how would this not violate these basic rights that the Constitution has given us, and this commitment of government to provide this. So you see together, we're not saying it must be X or Y, but we're saying that this commitment will not influence the diligence with which government seek to find a favorable outcome. So that's really, I think, that will help us get over the incommensurability of politics. We're trapped, but this could be a lift out of this trap. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic. Sam, thank you so much for this. And to our listeners, just to say that we're going to be here again in 2 weeks' time, September 18, 2024, same time. And I'll be chatting with Jude Ilo on his new book, It Is Possible. And we're going to look at how to influence change in Nigeria. The role of civil society. Jude used to be the country head of the Open Society, but now runs an advisory firm, Thoughts and Maze. But again, Sam, thank you so much for this conversation. It's always a pleasure having you.